Well, welcome back, everybody, for another Sunday school teacher workshop. We've been apart for a while, and I ask your forgiveness on that. Of course, some of these weeks that we've been apart have been scheduled breaks within there, and I've been out of town on work and haven't been able to actually record these and put them on YouTube as I would like to do and have in recent weeks, but hopefully I'll fix that in any planned absences in the weeks ahead, although I don't have any that I can foresee. So anyway, we are on this particular lesson here, as you see it titled on the screen, God's Jealous Love, coming from the passage of Exodus 34, verses 1 through 14. Now, since you and I have been apart for quite some time, and I haven't had a chance to really give a little bit of context for the last probably 3 to 4 lessons. I'm going to build on that just a little bit to get us to this particular place right here. Now, of course, with a passage like this, in fact, I'm just going to switch right over to Exodus 34 on my Bible app. When you get to verse 6 through 7, I imagine for many of us that could be the place where we would want to just camp out for the 30 to 45 minutes that we're going to take to teach. And of course, that would not be a ill use of your time. However, again, you know my mantra. One of the things I think it's integral for us as teachers is to understand that, of course, any of our students may be at varying places, and most likely are, in comparison to other students in our class with respect to just basic biblical knowledge. And so with that, trying to help them understand how the Bible is progressing as a meta-narrative is going to be perhaps a bit more beneficial than just treating every passage like it exists in a vacuum, disconnected from the passage before. Internally or mentally, we know that's not the case. However, when we only talk about what we're dealing with in the passage that we read, and it's been 7 days or so since the last time we convened and talked about this particular passage, or that student might have actually been out for a few weeks, and with the way that we progress through the Gospel Project, you know a lot of times these focused moments on Sunday do not fall in sequence as goes we're talking about the very next chapter's material. Sometimes that happens, but last week we were just in Exodus chapter, I'll have to look back at my slide actually to see it. We were just in Exodus chapter 20, so we're actually leapfrogging 14 chapters worth of narrative material in this, and of course a lot has transpired to get us to where we are now, such that if we just talk about the context, especially those verses of 6 and 7 in Exodus 34, and don't connect this back to what's happened between Exodus 20 and 34 to help that make sense for why this passage is so significant, I think we might be doing our students a bit of a disservice. So I'm repackaging this title here, Israel, the Adulterous Bride. So let me just back build a little bit of context into this, at least from last week's material. So in Exodus chapter 20, in fact, it might be important for me to just go back there and start from the concept of what's going on in this passage and why Moses is making it so important. Historically, of course, one of the most important things here is that Israel is finally being formally constituted as a nation, right? They've been a wandering band of vagabonds that left Egypt and for several weeks now have been winding their way through what is now known as the Sinai Peninsula, through the Red Sea into modern-day Saudi Arabia, ancient Midian, where Moses was called from, to then go to Egypt and lead these people to this spot where God, in Exodus 3, said, "This is the sign by which you will know I'm with you, that you and the people will come and worship me here on this mountain." So now we're at that particular moment. Now, granted, they are all descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 patriarchal leaders of those tribes. They are known as Hebrews, but as far as them being a nation on the stage now with the rest of these nations that have been in existence for hundreds of years, we're looking at Edom and Moab and Ammon, and of course the various city-state kingdoms and peoples that populate those areas in the area geographically known as Canaan. So Israel has never been a nation, right? They've never had a king. They've never even had a homeland, just what was promised to them and bequeathed through that covenant promise from Yahweh to Abraham down the line now to them. And they're going to take that inheritance, right? That's where the journey is going to end. So now that they've been formally constituted as a nation at this particular moment, it's important that we recognize Moses is doing something very interesting in the way that he is framing this moment around Exodus 19, actually up through 24, where we were focusing last week only on Exodus 20. And when he's framing this up, he's actually using as the backdrop here the story of Adam and Eve. So let me just give you a few quick little nuts and bolts here. So on the mid portion of the screen, you're going to be looking at Adam and Eve, and the bottom is Israel. So real fast, in the beginning of the story with Adam and Eve, God blesses them, tells them to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. This is part of the covenant that God's made with them. You know this language. I've used it often with you. If you have to, go back to, listen to some of our early lessons back in Genesis when we were going through this particular portion of Scripture to kind of refresh yourself on this. But this is the covenant God makes with Adam and Eve. It's the covenant that he pushes forward with Noah after the flood is over with, using the exact same verbiage. And he told Noah in Genesis 6, I will establish my covenant with you. That is the covenant, not just hanging his war bow in the sky and promising never to flood the earth again. So how this pertains to Israel is God says, if you will carefully listen to my covenant, or listen to me and keep my covenant, then you will be my own possession out of all the peoples. God purposefully made the man and woman outside the garden, brings them in the garden. Granted, it's possible that the woman was made inside the garden. Either way is fine. But the story makes it very clear. God takes the man he made outside the garden, hedges him inside the garden, so that God could dwell with him in the garden, walk with him, sharing the wisdom that Adam is to guard, watch, and keep per the provisions and command of Genesis 2, verse 15, and share it with the other image bearer that's going to be made from him, his wife, Eve, and then the image bearers that they will procreate, right? So with that, Adam, of course, is not only going to be a king, but he's also commissioned to be a priest. And notice what God has said from the summit of Mount Sinai with his own voice that the people hear directly. In Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, although the whole earth is mine, he could have called anyone, but yet he says, you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. So God made an image-bearing priest that he hedged in the garden in the beginning, and God is taking this nation now, and he's saying he's going to make them a whole entire kingdom filled with priests that is meant to be exactly what Adam was and function the same way. Geographically, it's going to be in a different place. It's the place that God has called Abraham to and said, this land will forever be yours, with the same intent of what Adam was supposed to accomplish, filling the earth with God's glory. Now, the middle section of this screen, we see that when we go back to the story of Adam and Eve, God has shared a little bit of wisdom with them, and now he intends to test them with respect to that sharing of wisdom. He shared it with Adam, and Adam has the responsibility to share it with Eve. He tells them they can eat from any tree except for the one in the middle of the garden, tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God allows the serpent being to come in and to test them regarding that knowledge. Will Adam bend to what Yahweh says, trusting that what Yahweh has defined as good is to be followed, and what the serpent being is offering up that's contradictory to that is bad because it contradicts what Yahweh says? If he trusts that what Yahweh is sharing is wisdom, will he abide by that, or will he side with the serpent being? And of course we know the story there. But the reason why God is giving 10 commandments in Exodus 20 and the follow-on 3 chapters of 21, 2, and 3 are commands that have immediate impact for why they're going to be living and occupying the space around Mount Sinai is this very concept, right? And we see, and this is where we're getting toward the story we're supposed to be responsible for on Sunday, God allows this to be tested because this progresses after 20 through 23 is finished and God is done giving them all of this law, at least as much as he shares now. Then in Exodus 24, we have the second moment when Israel speaks loudly, tells Moses, everything that you've said, we will do. The second time, everything the Lord has said, we will do, which leads us to the right side of the screen over here, where we have the people saying in Exodus 24, verse 3, we will do everything that the Lord has commanded. Now, how this pairs up with the story of Adam and Eve is that God made a partner for Adam to accomplish what I'm calling mission 1 in filling the world with his glory as image bearers are born, and all of them share cooperatively in this mission of bringing the blessing of Eden outside of the garden eventually as they continue to incrementally fill the world and take over everything that God has made as far as all the land outside the garden. And again, that's Israel's mission. So a marriage happens inside the garden. Now, what is happening here at Sinai is essentially the same thing, except instead of it being a single human man and a single human woman, Israel is essentially taking the place of Eve, and Adam is being replaced by Yahweh, such that when Yahweh speaks in Exodus 20 through 23, but namely in Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 through 8, he is proposing a marriage covenant with Israel. When he says, if you will keep my covenant, even though it comes with stipulations that we might divide into moral things, ceremonial things, and whatnot, it's all part of a package deal where Yahweh is saying, I want you to be exclusively my people. That's why he said this over here. Although the earth is mine, you will be my kingdom. You'll be my holy nation. It's not at the exclusion of everyone else in the sense that God is just writing the rest of humanity off, but he wants these people to be exclusive to him as his inheritance, and he will exclusively be their God. Again, not at the detriment of everyone else, but for the sake of reaching out to everyone else, and through Israel, eventually undoing what happened at Babel. So that's what I really want to try to drive home here, is that by the time we get up to Exodus 34, we need to understand this pivotal moment here such that this lesson title makes sense. Israel has agreed to wed Yahweh, much like the scene of Rebekah with Abraham's servant who came out to seek a bride for Isaac. This is not allegorical per se. It's just talking about the idea that Rebekah had to agree, and of course Israel, they agree. They tell Moses twice, we'll do exactly what you said, what Yahweh has commanded. So in Exodus 24, Moses binds them to the covenant through the sacrifice of blood and its manipulation. I should say sacrifice of an animal and the manipulation of blood. Sprinkling it on both the scroll he's written all the terms of the covenant on, and sprinkling it on the people. Then he is journeying up the mountain to participate in a wedding feast with Yahweh. We know this because Moses, Aaron's two oldest sons, Nadab, Abihu, Joshua, and 70 elders representing the people of Israel, because all of Israel, who numbers in the hundreds of thousands, could not possibly go up on Mount Sinai. So representatives go with them, and they all share a meal with Yahweh. And Yahweh appears to them as a human man, seated on a throne over a pavement that looks like sapphire or lapis lazuli. They sit in his presence, and they're not afraid of him, and he does them no harm. Why do they share this meal? It's ratification of the covenant, but it's a celebration of a marriage feast. Now, you might still be skeptical. If you read those passages, you might say, I see nothing in here regarding marriage. There's nothing even formalistically structured like a marriage. But in this particular lesson, it becomes all the more apparent because I want to share with you some passages from later writings that look back reflecting on this historical moment when Israel left Egypt and are brought to Yahweh's presence at Sinai, and how God frames this up as a marriage. Before we do that, an extra little piece of context, though, because here we are in Exodus 34. What necessitates what's happening here is what occurred 2 chapters before in Exodus 32, when Moses, for that first 40-day stint, is on the summit of Sinai. When that group of people went to have this wedding feast with Yahweh, the rest of them went back down the mountain, save Joshua, and Moses was called up into the cloud. For 40 days and nights, he is physically in Yahweh's presence. According to ancient tradition, Moses actually ascended into heaven through that cloud, that he's called up directly into Yahweh's throne room. Now, the text doesn't specify quite like that, but either way, Moses is the only one who gets to go that deep into the cloud to spend time in Yahweh's presence. But what are the people doing around the base of the mountain? They're wondering about what's happened to this Moses. Then they start to whisper in Aaron's ear. They offer up all of their gold trinkets because that's what Aaron decides to do. And then, of course, he throws them all in. He tells Moses later on, when Moses comes down infuriated at what's happened, that he just threw the earrings and stuff in there, and of course out jumps this calf. But it was Aaron from his own mouth who said, tomorrow we will have a great feast and celebrate around this, as the people are now exclaiming to the entire camp, this is your God who has led you out of Egypt. So how this parallels with the story of Adam and Eve, which is what we're going to be looking at here, is seen in the or through the lens of the events of Genesis chapter 3. So on the left side of the screen, we have Adam and Eve. Central column is Israel. Far right side of the screen, I want you to see how other writers in Scripture are taking this story of Exodus chapters 20 through 34 and looking back at that particular moment, leading up to after hundreds of years of them dwelling in the land and their continued apostasy and rebellion against Yahweh, why Yahweh is now, of course, bringing judgment on them. But, of course, it's just to show the importance of what happens here at Sinai with God wedding Israel and their adultery against him. So, first purple block, left side of the screen. The serpent being is talking to the woman, and the woman says to him, we may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God has said, you must not eat it or touch it, or you will die. So, God gave one command to Adam and Eve. Now that's being called into question here by virtue of the dialogue between the woman and the serpent being. And of course, Adam is close enough that he could stand up and interject if he wants to, but he doesn't. In the context of Exodus chapter 32, where they have rebelled against God and formed this golden calf, we rewind and go back to Exodus 20, and we hear what Yahweh says directly to Israel. Now, this did not come through the mouth of Moses. We must understand that before that moment, when Moses starts speaking to the people and telling them what the Lord requires, in the context of Exodus 21 through 23, Yahweh has spoken to the people. He's frightened them by virtue of the thunderings and the rumblings and everything else. And they plead with Moses, please do not let Yahweh speak anymore. You tell us what he has to say, or else if he continues to speak, we will die. But before that moment, they've heard these words directly from his mouth, where he says, do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or the earth below, which clearly the calf of Exodus 32 will count as that, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship. These people, by the time Moses comes down at the end of Exodus 32, have already done this. They've bowed in worship. They've genuflected, prostrated themselves in front of this. They've given up offerings to it, and they plan on the next day having a great festival where they will continue this and do even more. Do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, the way a husband has a right to be jealous over his wife, expecting exclusivity in their relationship. She belongs to him and he to her, and they to no one else. Bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who keep my commands because they love him. So going back to the story of Adam and Eve, here's where the serpent being comes in, and the woman sees the tree that it's good. It's delightful for the food that it can produce, or it has produced, and that she can partake of. But of course, there's the appeal of the wisdom that it offers, because now she'll be put on par with God. She will know right and wrong for herself. She won't have to depend on God telling her that, nor will she have to surrender her autonomy to God to trust what he says versus what she wants to define as right and wrong. She ate it. She gave some to her husband. Their eyes are opened. The rest of the story goes on, as you know. In Exodus 32, this is what we see. Then they said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it and made an announcement. So notice this. We have to slow the script down and let the events play out imaginatively as best we can see them transpire. That here the calf is. Aaron set it before the people. There might be a bit of a pause, some silence before someone speaks up and then makes the announcement, Israel, behold your gods. the one who has led you up out of Egypt, or maybe the ones who led you up out of Egypt. And then when Aaron sees the response of the people, you can imagine the roars of others around whoever that person was that spoke and said this. And you can see the great measure of acceptance the people have. No one seems to be crying out, this is blasphemous, and that this is clearly a violation of the covenant. No one is demanding this calf be destroyed or any of that. Possible, it could have happened, but we have no record of it, so we shouldn't surmise it did. That because as the serpent being in the garden says what he does to Eve, and it makes her stop for a second, contemplate, think about what he's offering, what he's saying, could it be true? It turns her toward the tree and then causes her to rethink everything she's thought about that tree and then go for the thing that she knows she's forbidden from having. Much in the same way, everybody around Israel has now joyously celebrated this triumphant moment where Aaron has successfully made a calf to represent Yahweh or maybe some other entity, and because he sees their response, he takes this a step further. So the linking verb here, of course, between both Aaron and the woman is the idea of seeing, and then seeing through their perverted, calibrated lens causes them to push this further and go deeper into sin. He says there will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow. So whether these people accorded that calf as representing Yahweh or not, Aaron certainly does. Early in the morning they arose, offered burnt offerings, which means the idea behind the burnt offering of Leviticus 1 is ascending through the burning carcass of the animal, and the smoke that rises from the altar is to ascend to the presence of the being the offerings being given to. Burnt offerings were not exclusive to Yahweh. They had been something that had been in practice for hundreds of years before Leviticus 1 was ever revealed or written. But that being said, burnt offerings are now a cultic rite by which an Israelite worshiper or even a foreigner can worship Yahweh as well. But of course it comes with a keen and precise understanding of what it means. So if they're offering burnt offerings to this calf at the altar prepared for it, they are pledging themselves to that particular entity, not to Yahweh, though they may call it by his name. They presented fellowship offerings, which means essentially what was going on the side of Mount Sinai, and this wedding feast with Moses and the representatives of Israel is now happening with this idol, right? And the people sat down to eat, drink, and got up to party. So, of course, the fatal outcome that comes from the Genesis 3 story is that God sends them away from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which they were taken. He drove them out, and he put the cherubim there and the flaming sword to prevent them from reaching their hand forth and taking from the tree of life. So now, of course, brokenness and sin and death enters in all of creation by virtue of what Adam and Eve does. So the consequence is the same here in Exodus 32. The Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me." Now notice, Moses has tried to plead on the part of Israel. He's even tried to offer himself up in their place, such that if God will not relent and forgive their sin, then he is asking that he place all of the charge against him, and he will take the prescriptive punishment while they get to live and, of course, go and experience the inheritance that God has prepared for them. But God says, "Who has sinned against me, I will erase from my book." Now, I don't want to really dive any deeper in that than what is said in the text, but that sounds very exact. It sounds very, what's the word I'm looking for? Final, that's it. It sounds very final, that God is saying he will not relent with respect to those who are responsible for this. However many there were, granted 3,000 fall by the sword, but there may have been more with respect to who were responsible or the culprits behind this. But God says he will erase them from his book. He will not show them mercy. Adam and Eve may have attempted to offer burnt offerings multiple times unto the Lord, or various other types of offerings, outside of the proximity of the Garden of Eden in an attempt to try to appease Yahweh. Now, granted, that's not written in the text, so we shouldn't surmise that happened, but maybe it did. Clearly, their sons are raised with the understanding of how to offer the proper burnt offerings, as displayed in Genesis 4. But clearly, what God never does, he doesn't pull back the cherubim stationed at the entrance to the garden. He does not sheathe the flaming sword to allow them entrance back in. This outcome is permanent. And God is saying this is a measure of exile levied against those who he deems responsible for what had just happened in the earlier portion of the chapter of Exodus 32, right? So what we can surmise here is that in Exodus chapter 20 through 24, God has proposed marriage. In Exodus 24, the people have said twice they will accept the terms of God's proposal, and they seek to be wed to him. They are wed to him in a ceremony of sorts where they are brought together, Yahweh on the summit of the mountain, the people at the base. Moses makes the sacrifice, sprinkles the blood on the people, binding them to Yahweh. And then with that, Moses has gone up the mountain to celebrate with representatives from Israel and the 70 elders and so forth and the priestly class. And then he's going to go up the mountain even further to tell the news directly to Yahweh and then receive further instruction for the tabernacle and, of course, the etched in stone version of the covenant that is meant to permanently be placed at the base of God's throne as an everlasting testimony to the agreement made between Yahweh and this nation he made for himself. But they break that covenant. Much in the same way God made a covenant with Adam and Eve in the garden, and they spat on and broke that. So to further drive home the idea of the significance here of Israel wedding Yahweh, let's go to a couple of other places far deeper in Scripture, where we look at prophets like Jeremiah, who in one of his oracles, as he's castigating Israel for their future rebellion, nearly 1,000 years later, when they're broken into two separate kingdoms, and this southern kingdom of Judah is on the brink of collapse under Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Why should I forgive you, the Lord asks? Your children have abandoned me and sworn by those who are not God. So clearly idolatry has continued to be a thorn in their side. I satisfied their needs, yet they committed adultery when they gashed themselves at the prostitute's house. So why does he say adultery? Why doesn't he say idolatry? Why does God, through the prophet Jeremiah, accord the blasphemous actions of what Israel's been doing in genuflecting, prostrating themselves before these foreign gods as adultery? Because that's exactly what it is. In the relationship he has with Israel, it is nothing short of complete spiritual idolatry, and it's to be met with the same measure of tenacity, of punishment that God has prescribed for what happens when an infidelity spouse in Israel is caught having sex with another person, not their spouse. It's death. It's a sin of high-handedness. It's not something that can be atoned for by any measure of sacrifice. And David's words of Psalm 51 bear that out very clearly. Or here in Ezekiel 23, a contemporary of Jeremiah. So actually, if you back up and read Ezekiel 16, and I don't have the time to do that, but I would encourage you to do that because there's a story here of how Yahweh is speaking about Israel's parentage, that essentially they've been born from idolatrous peoples, which is true because, as Joshua says about Abraham, coming from Mesopotamia, he was an idol worshiper. And he also makes it clear in both that passage, following on with this one, that Israel were also guilty of idol worship in Egypt. They were not exclusively faithful to Yahweh. A lot of times we go back and read the beginning of Exodus, and it makes it sound like for 400 years the people have been faithfully worshiping Yahweh in the good times, and even in the bad, they've just been constantly crying out to God because God says he hears their cries. So some may have been. There seemingly has always been a remnant. But several passages make it clear that even while they were in Egypt, they were still guilty of idol worship. So in Exodus 16, God talks about how essentially they were cast out like a baby that had been born and then just thrown out in the gutters. He finds them with their umbilical cord still attached, blood all over them. He says, no one had taken you up to wash you with water, rub you down with salt, or any of that. And he says, I did that. I took you to myself. I essentially raised you, provided for all your needs. I clothed you in royal garments. And even when you were at the age for love, which is a euphemism for marriage, God is saying, I took you to myself, right? He wed Israel to himself. Then in Exodus 23, he talks about the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. He calls them by the names of Aholah and Aholibah, who both act as prostitutes. They were married as virgins unto Yahweh, but they throw themselves to any and every suitor who will come by, which essentially are the nations that surround them and the gods that they worship, which in Ezekiel's day, as you bear out from the visions he has when he's taken from Babylon to the temple, and he sees all the shrines and things that are erected for various gods and goddesses in the courts of the temple. While they are still offering offerings unto Yahweh, it's very clear that both these kingdoms have become nothing short of prostitutes. And then, of course, Hosea, call your brothers, my people, and your sisters, compassion. Rebuke your mother, which is Israel. Rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. This is the Lord saying that, not Hosea. God is saying Israel is no longer my wife. So in the last couple of minutes here, I want to get to these final blue blocks here because I think this also helps with respect to the concept of what's being said in verses 6 and 7 when Yahweh reveals himself to Moses as being one who is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, because this becomes the root by which many other authors will take this and apply this to the woes of their own day, such as the psalmist here who says, "But you, Lord, are compassionate, a gracious God, slow to anger, and abounding in faithful love and truth." Because the psalmist is talking about how God has turned his back on Israel, essentially, leaving them to the fate they well deserve. But in this exilic sense, he is pleading that God would remember them and what he revealed to Moses so many centuries ago, that he is indeed faithful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Or Joel, in his day, though we're not exactly sure where in Israel's history he fits as a prophet, but he does say to the people to tear your hearts, stop just rending your clothes as a show or sign of lament and mourning here. Return to the Lord your God, because he's gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love, and he relents from sending disaster. Which, remember, in Joel's work, he says that God has sent the locust to destroy everything, but God is also willing to redeem the years lost by the infestation of the locusts. He will give back, but the people need to turn to him. And, of course, he will remember that he is faithful, merciful. Nahum, who was a prophet to the northern kingdom, the Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will never leave the guilty unpunished, which is very clearly borne out here in what he says in Exodus 32 to Moses. His path is in the whirlwind and storm, and his clouds are the dust beneath his feet. But notice this, slow to anger, coming directly from the formula of Exodus 34. And then finally, we get to this moment where in Exodus 34, this is what he says: the Lord is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in faithful love, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, which he's already said here. Forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity upon their children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. So I've ran out of time, don't have time to expound upon that, but hopefully this has kind of set you up for a little bit of a better introduction into the lesson, so that when you go into those particular moments, it will help you and your students better understand the significance behind that. So with that, any questions from the audience?